Welcome, my dear literature enthusiasts. I'm genuinely glad you're here today, joining me for what I like to think of as a fireside chat about cinema. If you enjoy thoughtful explorations of film, those kinds of deep dives that feel less like a lecture and more like sitting with a friend who just can't help but share what a story meant to them, then you're in the right place. And if this is your first time here, I'd love it if you'd subscribe and give this a like. Not because I'm chasing numbers, but because it really does help build this little corner of the internet into a community of curious minds. Before we begin, let me say this clearly. What follows is not a straightforward movie review in the traditional sense. It is, instead, an intellectual and reflective journey. An analysis framed for people like you and me, who come from a background in literature, philosophy, and storytelling, and who delight in peeling back the layers of meaning embedded in art. I remember the first time I encountered The Lion King, 1994. I must have been very young, old enough to understand that something momentous was happening on the screen, but too young to put words to the storm of emotions swirling in me. There was awe, yes, but also a kind of ache, as though I had stumbled into a story larger than myself, larger than childhood itself. Even now, years later, when I revisit it, I don't just see animated figures moving across the screen. I see echoes of Shakespearean tragedy. I hear the cadence of myths that have traveled centuries, and I feel the intimacy of lessons whispered by elders at the fire. What fascinates me is how a film made primarily for children manages to hold such universal gravity. It makes me think of literature classes where we would analyze fairy tales and realize, almost with shock, that beneath the surface of simplicity lay reservoirs of meaning. Grief, ambition, betrayal, redemption. This story is one of those tales, cloaked in vibrant colors and memorable songs, yet pulsing with themes as old as humanity itself. When I think back, I realize why it resonates so much with me personally. Growing up, there were moments when I felt burdened with expectations, when stepping into responsibility seemed terrifying. Watching a young lion cub stumble, falter, and ultimately rise into his destiny was like watching my own fears acted out before me. It was comforting in a way I couldn't have articulated then, but I can now. Art has a way of making our private struggles feel universal, reminding us we are not alone in the heaviness of becoming. The film itself unfolds like a classical epic, condensed into 90 minutes of visual poetry. It begins with the dawn, literally, the rising sun stretching across the savannah, animals gathering in a kind of ritual acknowledgement of a new era. It's both spectacular and profoundly symbolic. The cyclical nature of time, the eternal renewal of life. And though the music soars and our hearts swell, there's already an undercurrent of something more serious, almost solemn. Because whenever something new is born, we instinctively understand that something else must one day fade. As the story progresses, we are introduced to a tapestry of relationships, between father and son, uncle and nephew, friend and companion. Each relationship is drawn with a literary precision that reminds me of plays where every line serves a double purpose, moving the plot forward while also echoing themes of power, jealousy, or loyalty. The tension builds, quietly at first, then with devastating clarity, until the great rupture occurs. A moment that anyone who has seen the film remembers with a pang. And I won't spell it out here too directly. Instead, I'll say this. It's a betrayal that reverberates with the inevitability of Greek tragedy, and it forces the protagonist into exile, both physical and spiritual. What follows is not just a sequence of events but a kind of allegorical journey. Our hero wanders, ashamed and afraid, fleeing from both memory and responsibility. And isn't that something we all recognize? I recall times in my own life when running away felt easier than facing the truth of who I was supposed to be. The story gives form to that instinct, showing us how avoidance may bring temporary relief but not resolution. Eventually, the past always calls us back. And then, there's the moment of return, the facing of the shadow, the confrontation with both personal guilt and external evil. This is where the narrative transcends the individual and becomes myth. It's not merely one lion's story anymore. It's the story of any person, in any time, who has had to step out of fear and into the mantle of responsibility. That's why it feels so deeply human, even though the characters are animals. It's why I, sitting in my living room as a child, felt my own small heart beating faster as if the weight of my own destiny were being revealed. Of course, what makes the journey palatable, especially for children, is the way humor and companionship weave through the darker threads. The friends met along the way, the carefree wanderers who teach the philosophy of no worries. They are not just comic relief. They represent a worldview, an escape into lightness. At first glance, it seems tempting. Abandon duty, embrace pleasure, forget the past. And I'll confess, in my younger years, I too wanted to believe that life could be lived without consequence, that one could simply exist in joy and avoid the hard questions. But as the story reminds us, the world does not allow us such luxury. The past claws its way into the present, and responsibility waits patiently, demanding we pick it up. As the final act unfolds, we are brought back to the very place where the story began. The circle completes itself, but not in repetition. It is renewal, the same but changed. Watching it, I always feel as though I'm witnessing not just the end of a story, but the beginning of another. And maybe that's why it has stayed with me all these years. It never really ends. Every time the sun rises in that last shot, it rises also in me, reminding me of cycles, of endings that are beginnings, of the strange way we grow by returning. What's particularly striking to me, and perhaps to you as well if you approach film from a literary lens, is how the narrative borrows from multiple traditions. It's Shakespearean in its echoes of Hamlet, mythic in its invocation of archetypes, and biblical in its themes of exile and return. Yet it's presented with such accessibility that even a child can grasp its emotional truth. That duality, that ability to be both simple and profound, is the mark of great storytelling. Sometimes, when I rewatch it now as an adult, I find myself noticing details I never caught before. The way shadows lengthen in key scenes, the way music swells with minor chords to signal unease, the way silence is used just as powerfully as dialogue. These are the fingerprints of artists who understood that meaning is not only spoken but felt, carried in light, sound, and timing. And I think that's why the story endures, not because of nostalgia alone, but because it is crafted with the kind of care usually reserved for great literature. Let me tease something here for those of you who might be returning to it after many years. Don't just pay attention to the obvious moments, the ones everyone remembers. Look closer at the quieter exchanges, the glances between parent and child, the hesitation before a choice is made, the way a character lingers in the frame after the others leave. These subtleties are where the story whispers its deepest truths, and in them, I often find reflections of my own life. The hesitation before speaking, the weight of an unmade decision, the tenderness of fleeting connections. As with any great story, there are twists, moments where the ground shifts beneath us. And though we may remember them clearly, they still land with force when re-experienced. That's because they aren't merely surprises. They are inevitabilities. We don't gasp because we didn't see them coming, but because we did, and we dreaded them, and when they arrive, they hit us with the bittersweet satisfaction of prophecy fulfilled. That, to me, is the genius of the narrative. Now, I want to share something more personal. Whenever I think of this story, I'm reminded of a conversation I once had with my father. We were sitting outside one evening, watching the sun set, and he told me, almost casually, that his greatest hope was that I would grow into someone who could carry forward what he could not. At the time, I shrugged it off, too young to grasp the weight of such a statement. But years later, watching this story unfold again, I felt those words echo through me. It's strange how art has the power to make sense of moments in our lives that once seemed random. And so, as we prepare to dive deeper into this analysis in the next part of our journey together, I invite you to hold onto these reflections. Think about the times you've run from responsibility, the times you've been called back to confront what you feared, the times you've felt the warmth of friendship cushioning you against the darker truths of existence. Because that's what this story is ultimately about. Not lions, not villains, not even kings, but us. It's about the cycles we live, the choices we face, and the way stories, told well, can hold up a mirror to the most intimate parts of our being. So, thank you truly for joining me today. Your presence here makes this less of a monologue and more of a shared meditation, and I hope you leave not just entertained, but stirred, curious, maybe, to revisit the story yourself with fresh eyes. If you found value in this reflection, do consider subscribing so we can continue building this space where film is more than entertainment. It is literature, philosophy, and life itself. And until next time, may the stories you encounter remind you of your own strength, your own cycles, your own becoming. There are stories that don't just begin. They announce themselves. This one opens not with words but with a sunrise, a trembling of music, and the sense that something sacred is unfolding. Even now, when I think about it, I can feel that first moment as if it were pressed into my own memory. The light stretching over endless fields, the silhouettes of animals moving, almost worshipfully, toward a single point of gathering. It feels less like an introduction to a film and more like a myth being retold, a ceremony that has always existed. And I remember, as a child, leaning closer to the screen, breath caught, thinking, something important is happening here. The scene is, in essence, a coronation, though no one says it aloud. A young cub is presented to the kingdom, and in that gesture we understand everything. Legacy, continuity, the expectation of rule. The music swells, the animals bow, and for a moment the world feels ordered, harmonious, complete. I think of it now almost as an invocation, the way epic poems begin with a calling to the gods. Here, the gods are the rhythms of nature, the balance of the land, and perhaps even fate itself. But harmony never lasts long in stories that matter. Enter the shadow of jealousy, the voice that sneers instead of celebrates. The uncle, sharp-tongued and bitter, lingers at the edges of the light. He is not part of the celebration, and that exclusion festers. I have always found this detail striking. How often resentment grows not from being oppressed but from being overlooked. In literature, it's often the sibling left out of inheritance who schemes. Here, it's the brother denied the throne. His bitterness is almost Shakespearean, dripping with sarcasm, laced with cunning. Even as a child, I sensed the danger he carried, though I couldn't have explained it. The cub grows under the watchful eyes of a father who embodies authority with warmth. Their relationship, to me, has always been one of the film's greatest treasures. The father teaches not by fear but by guiding curiosity, walking side by side, pointing out the edges of the land, explaining what belongs to them and, crucially, what does not. I remember being fascinated by that conversation about boundaries, how the sunlit lands are theirs but the shadowy places are forbidden. To a child, it felt like the rules parents gave us: you may play here but not there. Yet beneath it, I sensed the gravity of something larger, the acknowledgement that power has limits, and wisdom lies in respecting them. There's tenderness, too, in the way the father imparts lessons. I think of one moment in particular, when he looks up at the stars and tells his son that past kings watch from above. As a child, I took that literally, picturing glowing lions nestled in constellations. As an adult, I hear the poetry of it, the way cultures across time have turned to the night sky for guidance, comfort, and continuity. It's more than bedtime reassurance. It's a worldview, a philosophy of legacy and belonging. And the way the cub gazes upward, wide-eyed, reminded me of myself at that age, believing the universe had order, that those who came before us could still guide us somehow. Of course, childhood is never content with boundaries. Curiosity burns hotter than obedience, and soon the cub seeks adventure beyond what is safe. This is where the story begins to shift. He is urged, slyly, by the uncle who masks manipulation as encouragement. I've often thought about how dangerous that is, that sometimes the voices that tempt us into risk are not our peers but those who know exactly what they're doing. The uncle doesn't shove him toward danger. He merely plants the seed, waters it with a little flattery, and lets youthful restlessness do the rest. And so, with a loyal friend by his side, the cub ventures where he should not go. I can almost feel the tension of those scenes, the thrill of disobedience. I remember watching and thinking of the times I myself had ignored warnings, sneaked beyond fences, convinced that adventure outweighed risk. It's a universal memory, the allure of forbidden places. The two friends tread nervously into the bones of an elephant graveyard, a landscape both fascinating and terrifying. The animators drew it like a nightmare. Angles sharp, colors muted, the air thick with menace. And, as expected, danger greets them in the form of predators lurking in the shadows. That encounter is one of the first real tests of the cub's bravery. He tries to roar, to summon the authority he doesn't yet possess. The sound that emerges is comically small, almost pitiful. But then, when his life is truly at stake, a real roar shakes the air. Not his, but his father's. The rescue is swift, terrifying in its display of power, and I recall feeling both relieved and shaken. Relieved because the cub was safe. Shaken because I realized how fragile that safety was. One slip, one mistake, and it could have been the end. The father's anger is not the thunderous rage one might expect. Instead, it is sorrowful, heavy with disappointment. He scolds, yes, but more importantly, he teaches again. That night under the stars, his words cut deeper. I'm only brave when I have to be. As a child, that line confused me. Weren't heroes always brave? But as I grew older, I began to understand. True courage is not recklessness. It is the strength to face danger when necessity demands it, not when pride or curiosity tempts us. That idea has stayed with me for years, guiding me in moments where I mistook bravado for bravery. Meanwhile, the uncle seethes. His first attempt to orchestrate tragedy has failed, but his cunning sharpens. I find his villainy chilling not because he is loud or flamboyant, but because he is patient. He plots like a chess player, moving pieces carefully, waiting for the moment when everything will fall into place. And when that moment comes, it is catastrophic. I almost hesitate to recount it because even now it stirs something raw. The uncle lures the cub into a gorge, staging it as a lesson, a game. Then he orchestrates chaos. A stampede, a thunderous wave of hooves. The sound alone is unforgettable, pounding like a heartbeat gone wild. Watching it, I felt panic claw at me, as though I too were trapped in that canyon with no way out. The father arrives again, leaping into danger without hesitation, forcing his way through the storm of animals to save his son. The scene is harrowing, and though I knew even as a child that heroes often emerge unscathed, something in me sensed that this time would be different. There's a moment, suspended in slow motion, when the father climbs desperately towards safety, claws digging into the rock, eyes searching upward. He reaches out, trusting his brother to help. And then comes the betrayal, delivered not with a shout but with a whisper, as if cruelty were more cutting when spoken softly. That fall, that silence after the thunder of hooves, felt like the world itself collapsing. I remember staring at the screen in disbelief, waiting for the moment when he would rise again, when the story would restore order. But he didn't, and I realized, maybe for the first time in my young life, that some losses are permanent. It was my first taste of tragedy, and it shook me deeply. The cub, in his innocence, blames himself. That detail always pierces me. How often do children carry burdens that are not theirs, convinced that their small actions caused great disasters? The uncle seizes this guilt, twisting it like a knife, urging the cub to run, to flee. And so he does, stumbling away, swallowed by dust and shame. I think of that image often. A small figure disappearing into a vast landscape, alone, believing himself unworthy of home. It reminds me of times when I too wanted to vanish, convinced that my mistakes made me unworthy of forgiveness. That's what makes this part of the story so powerful. It's not just about exile. It's about the crushing weight of guilt and the lies we believe about ourselves. In the wilderness, the cub collapses, exhausted, vulnerable. The world, harsh and unforgiving, seems ready to finish what betrayal began. But here, the tone shifts again. Rescue comes from unlikely companions, two wanderers who live by a philosophy of ease, who laugh at danger and sing away sorrow. When I first saw them, I felt a strange mixture of relief and skepticism. Relief because they were funny, light-hearted, a balm after such darkness. Skepticism because their worldview seemed too easy, too detached from reality. No worries, they proclaim, as if the past can simply be shrugged off. At that age, part of me wanted to believe them. Wouldn't it be wonderful if life could be lived like that? Free of responsibility, untouched by grief? Yet even then, I sensed that this carefree philosophy was not the answer. It was a detour, a resting place, but not a destination. Still, their friendship offered warmth, and for a time, the cub laughed again, played again, learned to live without the weight of expectation. And so, the story shifts into a lighter rhythm. Time passes, marked not by dialogue but by music, by the growth of the cub into something larger, stronger. Yet beneath the laughter, beneath the songs, a shadow lingers. Because no matter how far we run, no matter how cleverly we distract ourselves, the past waits. Responsibility, like a patient teacher, does not vanish simply because we turn our backs. It waits for the moment when we are ready, or perhaps when the world no longer allows us to ignore it. That is where the story pauses, not with closure, but with tension. A young cub, once destined for greatness, now grown yet hiding, living in borrowed philosophies, carrying wounds unhealed. A kingdom in disarray, ruled by bitterness and decay. A balance shattered, awaiting restoration. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the exile, the call of destiny quietly stirs. Time has a way of softening sharp edges. In the wilderness, far from the lands of birth and expectation, life begins to look different. Days blend into nights, laughter replaces grief, and the heaviness of the past becomes buried under routines of play and survival. For a long while, the young lion forgets, or at least pretends to forget. He runs across fields with his two companions, eats whatever the land provides, and sings along with their carefree motto. From the outside, it looks like healing. From the inside, it's avoidance, carefully wrapped in humor and song. I've often thought about that phase, how tempting it is to live as if yesterday doesn't exist. I remember times in my own life when I told myself I had moved on, when in truth I had only found clever ways to silence the echoes of my past. That's what this chapter of the story feels like. An extended pause, a shelter from responsibility disguised as freedom. And yet, even in the most carefully constructed escape, the past finds its way back. It begins almost gently, with the reappearance of a face from childhood. A friend, bold and unyielding, who remembers him not as the creature he has become but as the cub he once was. Their reunion is not warm at first. It's filled with shock, anger, disbelief. She cannot fathom why he has chosen this life of detachment, why he laughs while their home suffers. Their exchange is sharp, layered with old familiarity and new frustration. And beneath her words lies the truth. While he is hidden, others have borne the weight of his absence. This confrontation strikes me deeply every time I revisit it. It reminds me of moments when someone close has held up a mirror, forcing me to see the cowardice behind my excuses. It is never pleasant, being reminded of what we abandoned. And yet it is necessary. The hero resists at first, brushing her aside, insisting that the past is dead, that he cannot return. But her presence stirs something dormant, a spark he has tried so hard to smother. Later, alone, he wrestles with memory. The stars above look the same as they did when his father spoke of ancestral kings, but now they seem colder, distant. He feels unworthy of their gaze, unfit to be part of their lineage. And it's here that a new figure enters the story, a peculiar guide, playful yet wise, whose laughter masks insight. This character has always fascinated me. He doesn't lecture or scold. Instead, he unsettles, pokes, and teases until the truth bursts forth on its own. His wisdom lies not in instruction but in provocation, leading the lion to confront what he has hidden from himself. There is a scene, almost dreamlike, where the lion is led to water. He is told to look, to see. At first, all he notices is his reflection, the face of himself, grown but still uncertain. But then, as ripples shift, the reflection transforms, revealing not just himself but echoes of his father, a reminder that he carries more than his own identity. The sky itself seems to join in, clouds shaping into the visage of the lost king, a voice resonating with both love and command. Remember who you are. That line, simple and profound, has haunted me for years. How often do we forget who we are? How often do we bury our essence under fear, guilt, or distraction. Watching that moment, I felt my own pulse quicken, as if the words were meant for me as much as for him. It is a call not just to reclaim a throne but to reclaim the self, to stop running, to step into the fullness of one's being. The decision is not easy, but it is inevitable. Spurred by the memory of his father, the challenge of his friend, and the persistence of the strange guide, he resolves to return. His companions, though bewildered, choose to follow, proving that true friendship does not falter even when it means leaving comfort behind. And so begins the journey back, a return not only to a land but to responsibility, to the pain and possibility of home. Meanwhile, in his absence, the kingdom has withered. What was once lush and abundant has turned barren under the rule of the bitter uncle. The balance of nature is broken. Hunger and despair hang heavy in the air. When the hero arrives and sees this devastation, the weight of his neglect crashes upon him. Yet within that grief also lies resolve. He knows now that avoidance is no longer possible. The confrontation builds gradually. At first, he moves cautiously, reuniting with his mother, exchanging quiet, stunned glances with those who thought him gone forever. Their relief mingles with disbelief. Then comes the moment when he steps into the open, face to face with the usurper who destroyed his childhood. The shock on the uncle's face is fleeting, quickly replaced by scorn. Words are exchanged, sharp, biting, each sentence carrying years of unspoken accusation. The battle that follows is not merely physical. It is psychological. The uncle, master manipulator, seizes the moment to twist the knife of guilt once more. He reminds the lion of that fateful day, suggesting again that the father's death was his fault. For a moment, doubt resurfaces. I've always found this moment so painfully human. How easily old wounds reopen, how quickly guilt resurfaces even when we know, deep down, it is undeserved. But then, a revelation. The uncle, in his arrogance, lets slip the truth, admitting his role in the betrayal, confessing to the murder. The lie shatters, the weight lifts, and clarity returns. The lion, once bowed by shame, rises taller than ever before. The tide of the battle shifts, not because of strength of muscle but because of strength of spirit. The fight escalates, spreading across the rocky heights of the kingdom. Flames ignite, thunder crashes. The land itself seems to mirror the chaos of their struggle. Each blow, each fall, feels symbolic. Order against disorder, truth against deception, renewal against decay. The imagery is almost mythological, echoing every great battle of light against darkness. In the end, the uncle is defeated not by mercy but by his own nature. His former allies, once manipulated and controlled, turn against him when his cowardice is revealed. There is a grim symmetry in it. He who once betrayed is now betrayed, left to fall into the abyss of his own making. The story does not linger on his end. It simply allows justice to take its course. When the dust settles, the land is still scarred, the air still heavy. But there is hope. The lion, now fully grown not only in body but in spirit, climbs to the highest point, gazes across his kingdom, and releases a roar that echoes into the heavens. It is not just a sound of victory. It is a sound of restoration, of order reclaimed. The heavens answer with rain, washing away ash and sorrow, breathing life back into the earth. And then the circle completes itself. The story ends as it began, with a presentation, a gathering, a new life held high before the kingdom. But this time, the context is richer, the meaning deeper. We know what it cost to arrive here, what sacrifices and struggles brought about this moment. The sunrise feels earned, not given. Watching it, I always feel a rush of something larger than joy, something closer to awe. It's the sense that life continues, that even in tragedy, renewal waits patiently. What strikes me most, though, is how personal it feels. For all its grandeur, this story is not about kings and battles alone. It is about identity, responsibility, and the courage to face what we fear most in ourselves. I see in the hero's journey echoes of my own life. Times when I've run, times when I've been called back, times when I've finally stood tall. And I imagine you see reflections of your own journey too, in one way or another. That's what makes it timeless. It is not confined to one land, one kingdom, one species. It is the universal story of growth, loss, and renewal. When I close my eyes and think of it, what lingers is not just the image of a lion standing triumphant, but the quiet lessons whispered through it all. That bravery is not the absence of fear, but the choice to face it. That responsibility, however heavy, cannot be outrun forever. That even in exile, we carry within us the seeds of return. And most of all, that we are more than our mistakes. We are the sum of our choices, the echoes of those who came before, and the promise of those who will come after. So whenever I hear those opening notes of music, whenever I picture the sunrise stretching over endless fields, I feel not just nostalgia but recognition. I know this story, not because I've seen it, but because I've lived it in fragments, through mistakes, reconciliations, and the ongoing attempt to remember who I truly am. And perhaps that's why it will never fade, why it will always call to us like the voice of a father in the sky, reminding, urging, guiding us back to ourselves. There's something magical about how characters in this story aren't simply drawn figures or archetypes. They feel like embodiments of entire philosophies, like walking symbols stitched with human flaws and virtues. Each one carries a piece of a larger truth, and when their paths cross, what we see is not just conflict or comedy, but the collision of worldviews. That's why the tale endures. It isn't just about what happens, but about who these beings are, what they represent, and how they mirror our own inner struggles. Let me begin with the young cub who anchors the story. From the very first moment he is presented to the kingdom, there is an almost unbearable weight of expectation placed upon him. He is the heir, the promise of continuity. As a child, watching him chase butterflies and laugh with friends, I often forgot that he wasn't just a playful kitten. He was someone already marked by destiny. And that's precisely the tension. The innocence of youth colliding with the inevitability of responsibility. In him, I see echoes of my own younger self, those days when I wanted to believe I was free to do anything, only to discover that family, history, and duty had already carved paths I could not easily ignore. What fascinates me most about his character is the journey from naivety to understanding. At first, his bravery is a performance, a roar too small to shake the air, an eagerness to prove himself before he understands what true strength even is. His arrogance in those early moments feels familiar, doesn't it? That heady mix of innocence and pride, where we believe ourselves invincible simply because we haven't yet tasted real loss. And when loss does come, it doesn't just scar him, it defines him. He runs, he hides, he learns to mask pain with humor borrowed from others. Yet beneath all the layers of denial, the essence of who he is waits patiently. That is why his eventual return feels so powerful. It isn't about becoming someone new, but about finally remembering who he always was. Beside him stands the father, a figure who exudes both power and gentleness. Whenever I think of him, I picture that deep, resonant voice, words delivered not as orders but as wisdom. He is the kind of leader who doesn't need to shout to command respect. His lessons about the balance of life, the limits of power, the connection to ancestors, aren't just for his son, they are for us too. As a child, I took his words at face value, hearing them as instructions. As an adult, I feel them as philosophy. He is the embodiment of what it means to lead with both strength and compassion. What makes him unforgettable, though, is the way his presence lingers long after his physical absence. He becomes a symbol of memory itself, a reminder that the people we love don't vanish when they leave us. They live on in the stories they told, the values they instilled, the gaze we still feel when we look up at the stars. I cannot help but think of my own father here, of quiet evenings when he'd slip life lessons into ordinary conversations, and how those words now rise in me at unexpected moments. This character captures that universal truth. A parent's voice never truly disappears. Then, of course, there is the uncle, the foil, the shadow. If the father is all warmth and balance, the brother is all bitterness and hunger. His cunning is his power. He doesn't possess the physical strength to rule openly, so he schemes from the sidelines, weaving webs of deception. I've always found him chilling precisely because his villainy is so intimate. He doesn't destroy with brute force. He destroys with whispers, with manipulation, with the cruel brilliance of knowing where to press until someone breaks. In literature, he is the archetype of envy unchecked, the embodiment of how resentment corrodes the soul. And yet, part of me feels a strange pity for him. Watching him brood in the shadows while the kingdom bows before another, I can almost understand the ache of being overlooked. Perhaps that is why he resonates. He is not pure evil but the exaggeration of emotions we all recognize. Who among us hasn't felt jealousy? Who hasn't wondered what life would be like if we had been chosen instead of someone else? He shows us what happens when those feelings are left to fester, when they are fed instead of tamed. His end feels inevitable not because he is doomed by fate, but because he is undone by his own choices. The mother is a quieter presence, but one no less profound. She embodies grace under suffering, resilience in the face of despair. While her mate rules with authority, she rules with steadiness, her strength visible not in speeches but in the way she endures. In her, I see the archetype of the silent backbone, the figure who holds a community together even when the visible leader falters. She represents the strength of women who carry burdens quietly yet fiercely, and every time I watch her, I think of the women in my own life, mothers, grandmothers, aunts, who sustained entire families with love that was never flashy but always unyielding. The childhood friend, bold and uncompromising, is another fascinating character. She is the one who refuses to accept excuses, who challenges the hero when he hides from himself. Without her, the story might have ended in exile, laughter masking decay. But she is relentless in her honesty, her anger sharpened by love. She reminds me of those rare friends who love you enough to tell you the truth, even when it hurts, even when it risks the friendship itself. Her courage is not only in battle but in confrontation, in looking someone in the eye and saying, "You are more than this." To me, she represents loyalty in its truest form, not blind support, but the courage to demand growth from those we love. And then there are the wanderers, the unlikely pair who rescue the cub when he collapses in the wilderness. At first, they seem like comic relief, their lives governed by jokes, songs, and the refusal to worry about tomorrow. But the more I think about them, the more I realize their importance. They embody a philosophy, one that appeals especially to the wounded. The idea that the past can be ignored, that life can be lived in perpetual lightness. Their humor is contagious, their companionship genuine, and they provide the hero with the space to breathe, to grow without the crushing weight of grief. Yet their worldview is incomplete. As much as I laughed at their antics as a child, I came to see that no worries cannot sustain a life forever. Still, they are not to be dismissed. They represent a necessary stage of healing, the period when laughter becomes a balm, when survival takes precedence over responsibility. Without them, the hero might have perished in the desert. With them, he lives, learns joy again, and eventually finds the strength to face the truth. In that sense, they are guardians of a different kind of wisdom, the reminder that healing often begins not with solemnity, but with play. One of the most intriguing figures for me has always been the strange guide, the one who dances between comedy and mysticism, who unsettles rather than comforts. His role is brief but transformative. He is the archetypal trickster, the shaman who reveals truth through riddles and laughter. When he tells the lion to look into the water, when he insists that the Father still lives within, he is not merely offering comfort. He is forcing confrontation. I love how his wisdom comes wrapped in absurdity, reminding me that sometimes the greatest truths arrive not in solemn tones but in the guise of playfulness. He is the hinge of the story, the one who turns avoidance into awakening. And finally, the predators who serve as henchmen for the uncle. They are often treated as secondary, their menace undercut by bumbling humor. Yet I find them fascinating too. They embody hunger, literal hunger, yes, but also the hunger that comes from being marginalized, denied, pushed to the edges of the circle. They follow the uncle not out of loyalty but out of desperation, because he promises them a share in what they have been denied. In them, I see a commentary on how easily those who feel excluded can be swayed by dangerous leaders. They are not inherently evil. They are shaped by scarcity and resentment. And that, in its own way, is tragic. Together, these characters form a tapestry of human experience. The king who rules with wisdom, the son who runs from himself, the uncle who corrodes from envy, the mother who endures, the friend who challenges, the wanderers who heal through laughter, the guide who provokes truth, the predators who hunger. Each of them carries a piece of the whole, and together they create a story that feels less like fiction and more like reflection. When I step back and think about them collectively, what I see is a mirror of life itself. We are, at different times, each of these characters. We are the innocent child who overestimates our strength. We are the grieving soul who runs from responsibility. We are the manipulator who resents others' light. We are the loyal friend who demands honesty. We are the wanderer who hides pain in jokes. We are the guide who unsettles others into growth. The brilliance of the story is that it doesn't present these figures as distant archetypes, but as parts of us. That's why it resonates so deeply. It whispers, "This is you too." And perhaps that is the greatest character of all. The circle itself. The way each figure plays a role in a cycle larger than themselves, the way their choices ripple into the next generation. Watching the final scene, when a new life is presented to the kingdom, I always feel the characters folding back into the whole. They are not isolated. They are threads in a tapestry that continues beyond them. That is the essence of character here, not individuals frozen in time, but living parts of an eternal rhythm. When I think about stories, I often wonder not just about what we see on the screen, but about the hidden currents that shape them, the accidents, the coincidences, the odd little choices that somehow led to what became timeless. This film, for all its majesty, is stitched together with threads of the unexpected, the accidental, and sometimes even the absurd. To me, that makes it even more magical. Knowing that beneath its polished surface lies a history as messy and human as our own. One of the strangest truths about this story is that, at the beginning, it wasn't supposed to be a crown jewel. In fact, within the studio walls, it was almost treated as the second project. While the animators with prestige gravitated toward the grand retelling of Pocahontas, many of the younger or less celebrated artists were handed this animal picture. Some even thought of it as a stepping stone, something that might be good practice but not necessarily groundbreaking. That still astonishes me. A masterpiece, born from lowered expectations. It reminds me of how often in life we underestimate what seems small, only to look back years later and realize that the side project was the one that defined us. The production itself was filled with peculiar challenges. Animating animals with realism was no easy task, and so the studio did something unusual. They brought live lions into the workspace. I picture those young animators, sketchbooks in hand, watching with both awe and terror as massive cats padded across the floor, their muscles rippling under golden fur. One artist later recalled how the smell of the lions lingered for weeks, clinging to the air conditioning vents. It makes me laugh to imagine someone designing a majestic sunrise sequence while trying not to gag at the scent of big cats. But that's art, isn't it? The sublime and the ridiculous, side by side. Music, too, came together in the oddest of ways. The opening chant, that spine-tingling cry that announces the sunrise, wasn't meticulously rehearsed at first. The story goes that Lebo M, a South African composer, was brought in somewhat unexpectedly, and when he delivered that chant, it was recorded in just one take. Imagine that, one of the most iconic sounds in film history, captured in a single breath. It's strange how often brilliance happens not through endless polishing but through the raw power of a moment. Then there's the drought, both literal and metaphorical. During the production of the Wildebeest Stampede, the team faced a problem. How to create something that felt overwhelming, chaotic, yet believable. Computers were still a novelty in animation then, and so they wrote custom software just for that scene. Each wildebeest was given programmed behavior so they would move like individuals, not clones. I love this detail. A scene meant to embody unstoppable chaos was actually orchestrated through painstakingly ordered code. It's a paradox and somehow deeply poetic chaos created through control. Of course, not everything went smoothly. Early drafts of the script bore almost no resemblance to the story we know now. At one point, the project was called King of the Jungle, despite the fact that lions don't live in jungles at all. Another draft leaned more heavily into political satire, envisioning the uncle as a comic tyrant rather than a menacing villain. Imagine that. The shadowy betrayal played for laughs instead of chills. It makes me wonder how fragile stories are in their infancy, how easily they might have taken a wrong turn. And yet, somehow, through rewrites and revisions, the soul of the tale emerged. There were other strange shifts, too. The famous song, Can You Feel the Love Tonight, almost never made it into the final cut in the way we know it. At one point, the Wanderers were supposed to sing it themselves, turning it into a comic number rather than a soaring ballad. Elton John, who had poured his heart into the melody, reportedly begged the studio not to ruin it. He wanted romance, sincerity, not parody. Listening to the final version now, with its sweeping emotion, I silently thank him for insisting. It's a reminder that sometimes one person's conviction saves an entire work of art. And what about the storm itself, the actual storm that nearly destroyed years of work? During production in Los Angeles, an earthquake hit. The building shook, reels fell, and artwork was damaged. Animators rushed to save their sketches, clutching fragile papers that represented months of effort. Some of those drawings were lost forever. When I think about it, I shiver, how close we came to losing pieces of what became cultural memory. Nature itself seemed to test the resilience of the creators, echoing the very themes of survival and renewal that pulse through the story. There's also the eerie way the film's themes aligned with Shakespeare. The parallels to Hamlet, the usurping uncle, the exiled son, the weight of revenge and destiny, weren't always intentional. In fact, some animators resisted the comparison at first, not wanting to tether themselves too tightly to high literature. But over time, the resemblance became undeniable and eventually embraced. I find this fascinating, that art can stumble into archetypes without even trying, as if certain patterns are etched into our collective psyche, waiting to resurface. Another strange fact, the language of the villain's songs. In one infamous line, the uncle's anthem actually quotes from a Nazi rally, both in visual imagery and in rhythm. Animators drew inspiration from Triumph of the Will, a 1935 propaganda film, for the sequence where followers march in perfect formation. The choice was deliberate, unsettling, and meant to paint tyranny in its darkest form. To think that a children's film borrowed imagery from one of history's most chilling documents. It's startling, and yet it works. It turns parody into warning, a reminder that evil often cloaks itself in grandeur. Some details are smaller, stranger, almost whimsical. The meerkat's dance moves in one sequence were improvised by animators who studied old vaudeville acts. The warthog's voice actor reportedly belted songs so loudly in the booth that neighbors complained. And in an odd twist, the hyenas were once considered too frightening, so their personalities were softened with humor, though their laugh remains one of the eeriest sounds in the film. I love, too, the odd connections to real animals. Researchers who studied lion prides for the film discovered that actual male lions sometimes killed cubs that weren't theirs, a brutal truth that fed into the uncle's darker traits. Yet the film softens this with mythology, giving us betrayal rather than biology. Still, knowing the truth behind it adds an extra chill. The cruelty we see on screen has roots in reality. And then there are the accidents of casting. The booming voice of the father, so iconic now, was nearly absent. The actor originally hesitated, thinking an animated film might not be worthy of his gravitas. Imagine if he had refused, the character would have been entirely different, perhaps forgettable. Instead, his presence gave the film its spine, its soul. On the other side, the uncle's voice actor nearly walked away after disagreements over tone, but was persuaded to stay. The result is one of the most deliciously sinister performances in cinema. Strange how close we came to missing both. Even stranger are the myths that grew around the film afterward. Some swore they saw secret messages hidden in the stars during one scene. Others claimed the movie plagiarized an older Japanese work about a white lion. Debates flared, lawsuits threatened, though none ever truly dimmed the film's glow. For me, these myths only add to the aura. Every great story spawns rumors, legends that cling to it like shadows. The success itself was almost accidental. Executives didn't predict it would dominate the world. They thought the safer bet was the other project, the one grounded in history and romance. Yet when the box office receipts came in, the animal picture outshone them all. It became a phenomenon, a cultural touchstone, inspiring Broadway adaptations, sequels, even documentaries about the making of the documentary. And it all began as a project people underestimated. There's something wonderfully strange about that. How often the overlooked rises to define a generation. Looking back at all these odd details, the lions wandering through hallways, the earthquake shaking sketches from walls, the chant recorded in a single breath, the villains echoing history's darkest moments. I find myself marveling at the chaos of creation. Great works are not born cleanly. They stumble, they fracture, they nearly collapse. And perhaps that is why they endure, because they are forged not in certainty but in struggle, not in perfect planning but in the unpredictable dance of chance and persistence. When I watch the film now, I don't just see the story of a lion. I see a room full of young animators sketching furiously while lions prowl behind them. I hear the sudden silence after an earthquake, followed by frantic footsteps rescuing drawings. I picture Elton John frowning, insisting that a love song must remain a love song. I imagine programmers wrestling with lines of code, trying to make wildebeests run in chaos. These hidden stories run parallel to the one on screen, and together they form something richer than fiction alone. The strangest fact of all, perhaps, is that none of these oddities show on the surface. To the viewer, it is seamless. The sunrise is perfect, the music flows, the animation dances. We don't see the sweat, the fear, the arguments, the accidents. And yet, knowing them deepens the experience. It reminds me that behind every polished piece of art lies a mess of humanity. Imperfect, unpredictable, strange. And isn't that comforting? To know that masterpieces are not the product of perfection, but of persistence through strangeness. So when the sun rises over the savannah in those opening moments, I smile not just at the beauty but at the hidden history. At the lions who smelled up the studio. At the one-take chant that still gives chills. At the quake that nearly erased it all. At the overlooked project that became legend. It is a reminder that the strangest facts are often the most beautiful. That accidents make art, that oddities birth masterpieces, and that sometimes the most underestimated stories are the ones destined to last forever. There are certain moments in film that don't just sit on the screen. They stretch out, grab us by the heart, and refuse to let go. This story is woven from those moments, stitched with events that feel larger than themselves. They unfold like parables, charged with meaning that lingers long after the credits roll. Whenever I return to it, I find myself less interested in what happens and more captivated by how those happenings speak. How they press against memory, how they whisper into the quiet corners of our own lives. Let's begin where it all begins. The rising sun, the gathering of creatures, the ceremonial presentation of new life. This opening event has been described as one of the most iconic sequences in animation, and rightly so. Yet what makes it resonate isn't just the grandeur. The swelling music, the vibrant color, the symmetry of animals bowing. What makes it powerful is its invocation of ritual. It feels like the first pages of an epic poem, an invocation of the muses. We are not merely watching animals gather. We are witnessing the creation of myth. Critically, this sequence sets the tone. Life itself is a circle, continuity is sacred, and every beginning already contains its own end. And immediately, through contrast, the film introduces its counterpoint. Just as light is established, shadow creeps in. The uncle sulks in darkness, his words dripping with disdain. His absence from the ceremony is not incidental. It is thematic. This moment tells us something crucial. There are always those who reject the ritual, who feel alienated from the communal act of celebration. His bitterness is not born in that instant. It is the culmination of years of exclusion. From a critical perspective, this absence foreshadows the central conflict. Harmony cannot exist without the constant threat of disruption from within. Then there's the father-son relationship, which forms the emotional spine of the story. Their early conversations, walking across the sunlit plains, gazing at the stars, are not filler. They are philosophical treatises disguised as bedtime chats. When the father explains the balance of life, how even kings must respect the cycle, he delivers more than parental advice. He articulates an ecological ethic, one that resonates today as much as it did in the 1990s. It is a reminder that power without humility leads to ruin. That message, embedded in a children's film, has critical weight. It positions the story not just as entertainment but as moral instruction. The Forbidden Place, the shadowed valley filled with bones, is another event brimming with significance. At first glance, it's a simple narrative device, a location of danger to test youthful curiosity. But looked at critically, it becomes a metaphor for human transgression. Every culture has its boundaries. The tree of knowledge, Pandora's box, the locked room. To tell a child, this is forbidden, is to ignite their imagination, to tempt them into defiance. This scene captures that universal truth with uncanny precision. And when the cub ventures into the graveyard with his friend, the audience is pulled into the archetypal story of disobedience leading to near ruin. The arrival of danger, the hyenas circling, their laughter echoing, escalates the lesson. This isn't just a fight for survival. It's the first brush with mortality. The cub's attempt to roar, producing only a pitiful squeak, is symbolic of youthful bravado exposed. But when the father intervenes, roaring with the voice of true power, the contrast could not be clearer. Critically, this event serves two purposes. It humbles the son, showing him that strength is earned, not assumed. And it reminds us, the audience, of the protective yet fragile nature of parental love. Then comes the gorge. For me, this is the pivotal event, the one that cements the film's place not just in animation history but in the canon of modern tragedy. The uncle's manipulation, the staged stampede, the desperate climb. It is Shakespeare distilled into frames of color and sound. Watching the father fall, betrayed by his own brother, remains one of the most devastating cinematic experiences. Critics have long noted how unusual it was, in a film aimed at children, to depict such raw and permanent loss. Yet that boldness is precisely why the film endures. It does not flinch from grief. It insists that children confront it alongside their elders. In that sense, it is less a movie event than a cultural rite of passage. The son's exile is another critical juncture. Driven by guilt instilled through manipulation, he flees into the wilderness. The event resonates because it captures a universal psychological truth. When tragedy strikes, we often blame ourselves, even when logic tells us otherwise. This flight from home is not just physical. It is emotional exile, the cutting off of one's own roots. From a critical perspective, this sequence exemplifies Joseph Campbell's concept of the hero's journey. The departure stage, the abandonment of the known world in search of self-discovery. Enter the wanderers. Their light-hearted philosophy of no worries brings comic relief. But beneath the humor lies critical depth. Their motto embodies a worldview of escapism, one that denies responsibility in favor of pleasure. For a time, this philosophy soothes the wounded hero. But the critical viewer sees its insufficiency. Escapism delays reckoning but cannot prevent it. These characters, then, are not just comic sidekicks. They are embodiments of avoidance, necessary but temporary companions on the path to growth. Another event that demands reflection is the return of the childhood friend. Her arrival shatters the illusion of carefree living, confronting the hero with the reality he has avoided. This confrontation is crucial. It represents the intrusion of truth into the comfortable cocoon of denial. In literary terms, she is the herald, the voice that calls the hero back to the world of responsibility. Critics often emphasize this event as the turning point where the narrative shifts from wandering to purpose. And indeed, without her insistence, the story might have lingered forever in exile. Then there is the encounter with the strange guide, a character who blurs the line between comedy and mysticism. The moment at the water, when the hero looks into his reflection, is perhaps one of the most critically celebrated scenes in the film. Here, symbolism runs deep. The reflection that reveals not only the self but also the lineage, the sky that transforms into the face of the father, the voice that commands, "Remember who you are." This event is both narrative and metaphysical. It embodies Jungian archetypes of the self, the integration of shadow and memory, the reconciliation of past and present. Critics have interpreted it as a moment of individuation, when the hero finally aligns with his true identity. The return home carries its own weight. The kingdom, now barren under the uncle's rule, reflects the consequences of neglect. This desolation is not incidental, it is visual allegory. The land mirrors the moral decay of its ruler. Critics often highlight how this use of environmental imagery echoes biblical and mythological traditions. When the king is corrupt, the land withers. When order is restored, fertility returns. It is a reminder that leadership is never private. It ripples outward, shaping the lives of all. The confrontation itself, the climactic battle on the rocky heights, demands careful analysis. At first, the uncle nearly triumphs again through manipulation, convincing the crowd that the hero caused the father's death. This tactic underscores a critical theme. Lies are often more persuasive than truth, especially when they prey on guilt. But when the truth slips out, that the uncle himself was the murderer, the illusion collapses. The revelation restores moral order, reminding us that deception cannot sustain power indefinitely. The battle that follows, with flames raging and the sky thundering, is more than spectacle. It is elemental theater. Fire symbolizes both destruction and purification, a fitting backdrop for the resolution of betrayal. The hero's victory is not merely physical, it is moral. He triumphs because he has embraced responsibility, because he has remembered who he is. Critics often compare this climax to classical tragedy inverted. Instead of the hero's downfall, we witness renewal. Finally, the closing event, the presentation of a new cub, is a return to the beginning but transformed. The circle is complete, yet not repetitive. We, the audience, feel the weight of everything that has happened between the two sunrises. This cyclical structure is critical to the film's resonance. It suggests continuity, the passing of responsibility across generations, the eternal rhythm of life. No ending could be more fitting. What fascinates me, from a critical standpoint, is how these events collectively shape reception. Audiences wept at the gorge scene, laughed with the wanderers, felt awe at the sunrise. Critics praised the film for its willingness to blend humor with grief, myth with melody. It was received not just as a children's story but as a universal tale, one that spoke across cultures and ages. Its impact lay precisely in its refusal to condescend. It trusted children with tragedy, adults with playfulness, everyone with the challenge of reflection. And thematically, the resonance is profound. Every event reinforces the central ideas: the tension between responsibility and avoidance, the cycle of life and death, the necessity of remembering one's identity. The emotional weight of the film comes not from a single moment but from their interplay. We laugh because we know we will soon cry. We cry because we know renewal awaits. We feel awe because we sense that beneath the animated surface lies something older, something mythic, something eternal. When I step back and consider the film through critical eyes, I see not a sequence of events but a carefully crafted symphony. Each event is a note, sometimes bright, sometimes dark, but always part of the larger melody. And when that final roar echoes across the kingdom, what we feel is not simply triumph but harmony, the restoration of balance, the reaffirmation of the circle. And perhaps that is why, even decades later, the film continues to resonate. Its events are not bound by time or place. They speak to us as children learning about loss, as adults grappling with responsibility, as human beings searching for meaning in the cycles of our own lives. Critically, emotionally, thematically, it endures because it is not just a story we watch but a story we live. When we watch a finished film, we see perfection, or at least the illusion of it. Every frame polished, every note soaring, every scene unfolding with a sense of inevitability. as though the story had always existed just waiting to be told. But the truth behind any film, especially one as monumental as this one, is far stranger and messier. What fascinates me most about the production of this story is that, at the beginning, nobody thought it would matter much. Inside the studio, it was treated almost like the second-tier project. The brightest animators and writers were pulled toward another film, one considered more sophisticated, leaving this tale about lions and savannas to a group of younger, less celebrated artists. Some even called it the B-team movie. It makes me smile now, thinking of how wrong they were. Isn't it strange how often masterpieces are born when no one is expecting greatness? In fact, the working title wasn't even the one we know. For a long time, it went by King of the Jungle, a peculiar misstep, since lions don't live in jungles. That slip shows how uncertain the project's identity was in its early days. The script, too, looked very different at first. Early drafts leaned toward political satire, with the villain as more of a bumbling tyrant than a sinister schemer. Other drafts toyed with the idea of making the story far less mythic and more comedic. It's unsettling to imagine that if a few decisions had tilted the other way, we might have ended up with something forgettable, a mere cartoon about animals squabbling instead of a cultural touchstone. The animators themselves face challenges that sound almost absurd. How do you capture the majesty of lions if you've only ever seen them in books or at the zoo? The studio decided to bring live lions into the workspace. Imagine sitting at your drawing desk, pencil poised, while a full-grown lion prowls just a few feet away, its breath fogging the air, its muscles rippling with terrifying grace. Some artists admitted they were too nervous to draw at first, distracted by the sheer presence of such creatures. Others described how the smell lingered in the studio long after the lions were gone, an earthy, musky reminder that the majesty of the savannah had invaded the air-conditioned hallways of Burbank. And yet, those lions were essential. Watching them walk, stretch, and yawn gave animators details no textbook could provide. It's why the characters on screen feel grounded, why their movements carry weight and elegance. That decision to bring lions into the studio may have seemed eccentric, but it became one of the building blocks of authenticity. Then there's the music. The opening chant, the one that still sends shivers racing down my spine whenever I hear it, was recorded in the most unlikely way. Lebo M, the South African composer, walked into the studio, stepped up to the microphone, and in a single take unleashed that thunderous cry. No rehearsals, no endless retakes. Just one raw, perfect moment that has echoed through decades. Think about that. One of the most recognizable openings in film history, born in less time than it takes to brew a cup of tea. It's almost mythic in itself, as though the song was waiting for someone to breathe it into existence. The wildebeest stampede. Oh, that sequence nearly broke the production team. Animation in the early 1990s had never attempted something so ambitious. The question was, how do you animate hundreds of wildebeests without drawing each one by hand? The solution was radical for its time. Custom computer software. Programmers wrote code that gave each wildebeest a set of rules, how close it would run to another, how it would turn, how it would stumble, so that, when released, the herd moved with believable chaos. What looks like pure nature on screen was, in truth, the result of meticulous coding, each digital wildebeest an actor with programmed instincts. It's funny to think of animators, who spent their lives sketching with pencils, now collaborating with computer scientists to simulate panic and dust. The result was groundbreaking, a glimpse of how animation would forever blend hand-drawn art with digital technology. Yet production wasn't just innovation, it was chaos. Midway through, Los Angeles was hit by an earthquake. Walls shook, reels tumbled, desks overturned. Animators scrambled to save sketches, clutching stacks of fragile paper as if they were lifeboats. Some artwork was lost, forever erased by falling debris and dust. Others survived only because someone happened to be nearby to grab them. Whenever I watch the gorge scene, I think of that earthquake, the real trembling earth that threatened to undo the imagined one. The parallel feels uncanny. Just as the ground shakes beneath the characters, so too did the ground shake beneath the artists. Casting added its own strangeness. The father's voice, now iconic, was almost absent. The actor initially hesitated, unsure if lending his gravitas to a cartoon was worth it. Only later did he agree, and with that choice, the entire tone of the film shifted. His voice carried not just authority but warmth, transforming lines that could have sounded stiff into timeless wisdom. On the other side, the uncle's voice actor nearly walked away after disagreements, but eventually stayed, gifting us one of the most chilling performances ever put to animation. How fragile it all was. One actor's decision could have altered history. Even the songs had their dramas. Can You Feel the Love Tonight nearly ended up as a comic gag sung entirely by the Wanderers, undercutting its sincerity. Elton John, horrified, pleaded with the studio to restore it as a true love ballad. Without his insistence, the emotional heart of the film might have been reduced to slapstick. I think about that often, how one stubborn plea preserved a song that went on to win an Academy Award. Sometimes, protecting art requires sheer stubbornness. Production meetings were full of peculiar debates. Should the hyenas be terrifying or funny? Should the hero's exile feel tragic or playful? Should the story lean closer to Hamlet or distance itself? Each decision shaped the tone, and the balance was delicate. Too much humor and the tragedy would collapse. Too much darkness and children would flee the theater. The final product feels seamless, but behind the scenes it was a tightrope walk, with directors and animators constantly adjusting, recalibrating, searching for equilibrium. I love the small, almost absurd anecdotes too. One animator joked that he spent 3 weeks drawing nothing but dust clouds. For the stampede, for the desert, for every step of fleeing hooves. Another admitted that his hand cramped so badly from sketching blades of grass that he had to soak it in ice water. Someone else described how the coffee pot in the studio was never empty, as though caffeine itself were fueling the savannah. These little glimpses remind me that even masterpieces are built on sore muscles and overbrewed coffee. And then there are the myths. Some viewers swore they saw secret messages spelled in the stars of one scene. Rumors spread, accusations flew, though the animators insisted it was nothing more than drifting dust. Yet the myth endures, part of the aura surrounding the film. Another controversy erupted over alleged similarities to a Japanese series about a white lion. Some called it homage, others plagiarism. The truth is murky, tangled in cultural exchange and coincidence. But the very existence of such debates shows how deeply people cared, how fiercely audiences wanted to protect what they loved. Even the reception was a surprise. Executives had assumed that the historical romance project would outshine the animal picture. But when the numbers came in, it was this film that roared at the box office. Critics praised its willingness to blend Shakespearean tragedy with Disney spectacle. Audiences wept, laughed, returned again and again. The Broadway musical followed, then sequels, then a global phenomenon. Yet I always returned to that strange beginning, when it was dismissed as secondary. There's a strange beauty in that, how something underestimated can rise to define an entire generation. The production crew often spoke of how the film seemed to take on a life of its own, as though it were guiding them rather than the other way around. Animators recalled moments when they looked at their drawings and felt chills, as if the characters were breathing back at them. Composers spoke of melodies that seemed to write themselves. Directors admitted that some scenes felt almost faded, as though they had stumbled into myth rather than created it. Listening to them, I can't help but wonder if certain stories are meant to exist, and people are merely the vessels through which they arrive. For me, knowing these production insights doesn't diminish the magic. It deepens it. When I hear the opening chant, I think of Le Bohème stepping to the microphone, one breath birthing a legend. When I watch the wildebeests thunder across the screen, I think of programmers typing lines of code late into the night. When I see the father's noble stance, I think of an actor hesitating, then choosing to lend his voice. When I feel the earth tremble in the gorge, I think of animators diving under desks as an earthquake rattled their drawings. These stories remind me that behind the polished surface lies imperfection, struggle, and accident. And that is what makes it human. Masterpieces aren't born of certainty. They are forged in messiness, in stubbornness, in luck. They are drawn by tired hands, saved by last-minute pleas, carried through earthquakes and doubts. And somehow, all those imperfections weave together into something seamless, something that feels inevitable. That's the greatest fun fact of all. That what feels eternal and mythic on screen is, at its core, the product of ordinary people stumbling, arguing, persevering, and creating. It makes me love the film even more, because it tells me that greatness doesn't require perfection. It requires persistence, imagination, and the courage to keep drawing even when the earth itself shakes. When I think back on this story, I realize it would not be the same without its world. The characters, their conflicts, even their triumphs. They all draw their meaning from the land beneath their paws and the skies above their heads. In fact, the setting is not background at all. It is a living character, breathing with its own rhythms, shaping the moods, amplifying the themes, carrying the weight of myth. The very first image makes that clear. The rising sun over endless plains. That golden disk isn't just an ordinary sunrise. It feels ceremonial, as if the heavens themselves were acknowledging the birth of a tale. The light stretches across the savanna, pouring life into every blade of grass, every sleeping creature. And the camera, or rather, the animated eye, moves as if we are part of that awakening, traveling across rivers and cliffs, sweeping toward the iconic rock where life gathers. Already, the setting tells us something. This is a world of grandeur, where nature itself is woven into destiny. Pride Rock, of course, dominates the landscape, a jutting cliff carved from stone, rising above the plains. It is at once a throne, a stage, and a symbol. When I first saw it as a child, it seemed impossibly majestic, a place where history itself resided. Later, as I grew older, I realized how deliberately it had been designed. Its sheer angles echo the structure of a crown. Its placement ensures visibility from miles around, and its height makes it the perfect stage for ritual. Every time the king or heir stands upon it, the rock becomes more than stone. It becomes an emblem of legitimacy, of authority granted not by decree but by the land itself. From a cinematic perspective, Pride Rock functions as both anchor and compass. Whenever the camera returns to it, we feel the story returning to its center. And yet, the land is not only beauty. For every sunlit savanna, there is a shadowed counterpart. The elephant graveyard, that place still haunts me. A realm of bones and dust, tusks jutting from the ground like the remnants of fallen giants. As a child, it felt like stumbling into a nightmare landscape, the kind you only glimpse in the corners of your mind when fever dreams take hold. But even then, I sensed its meaning. It is the inversion of Pride Rock, where one symbolizes continuity and life, the other represents decay and death. The animators painted it with muted colors, sickly greens and grays, drained of vitality. Shadows stretch longer there, and the very air seems heavy. Notice how the sound design complements it. Echoes, whispers, laughter that feels disembodied. Together, these elements create not just a place of danger, but an atmosphere of corruption. The graveyard isn't frightening because of what we see. It's frightening because of what it feels like, the absence of balance. Between these poles, the sunlit Pride lands and the shadowed graveyard, lies the gorge. To me, the gorge is perhaps the most striking example of setting as fate. Its steep walls, narrow escape routes, and deceptive stillness make it a trap designed by nature itself. When the stampede arrives, the gorge transforms from neutral canyon to deadly cage, its echoing walls amplifying the thunder of hooves. I always find it chilling how ordinary the gorge seems before disaster. A quiet place, dusty and unremarkable. And yet, in that ordinariness lurks doom. It reminds me that settings in cinema often carry dual natures. They are one thing when calm, and another entirely when events erupt. The gorge becomes a crucible, a place where innocence dies and guilt is born. Of course, the film also explores spaces of exile and healing. The desert stretches endlessly, scorching and barren, where the cub collapses under the weight of guilt and exhaustion. I remember watching that sequence and feeling parched myself, as though the heat radiated through the screen. The desert here is more than geography. It is punishment, a symbolic purgatory where the hero is stripped of everything. The wide, empty shots emphasize loneliness, the contrast between his small body and the vast horizon making exile feel unbearable. And then, the setting shifts again. Lush greenery, waterfalls, a hidden paradise where carefree laughter is possible. The jungle of exile is saturated with color, every leaf and flower exaggerated in brightness, as if joy itself had taken botanical form. But there's something telling about it too. The paradise feels slightly too vibrant, almost unreal, as though masking the truth that it is temporary. It's a painter's trick, beauty that dazzles, but also distracts. The cinematography is just as critical as the locations themselves. Take the use of light and shadow. In moments of safety, the lighting is warm, diffuse, golden. During danger, shadows deepen, angles sharpen, colors cool. One of my favorite examples is when the uncle addresses the hyenas in his fiery anthem. The scene is bathed in green light, unnatural and eerie. The marching followers are framed in rigid lines, recalling imagery from propaganda films. That choice of lighting and staging isn't random. It transforms the setting into a visual metaphor for tyranny. Without a single spoken explanation, the colors and composition tell us everything we need to know about corruption and manipulation. Camera movement plays a role too. Notice how, in moments of awe, the camera swoops and glides, imitating the flight of birds, offering us vast panoramic views of the savannah. But in intimate moments, a cub nuzzling his father, a tearful reunion, the perspective tightens, the framing pulls us close. This oscillation between grandeur and intimacy mirrors the story itself. Epic in scope, yet deeply personal in emotion. It's as though the land and the lens conspire to remind us that both the kingdom and the individual matter equally. Rain and fire deserve their own mention. These elemental settings arrive at critical turning points. Rain, withheld during the uncle's rule, pours down after the climax, restoring fertility and hope. Fire, by contrast, engulfs the final battle, painting the rocks in apocalyptic red. The flames are not just dramatic spectacle. They symbolize cleansing, the destruction necessary for rebirth. Watching those scenes, I often think of mythic traditions where the world must burn before it can be renewed. And indeed, when rain quenches the flames, the cycle completes itself. Destruction gives way to life. What strikes me is how the settings mirror the emotional journey of the characters. When the hero is young, the world feels open, bright, limitless. When he falls into guilt, the land becomes hostile, barren. When he avoids responsibility, the jungle lures him with false comfort. When he returns, the pride lands themselves appear wounded, scarred by neglect. In this sense, the settings are externalizations of internal states. We are not just looking at landscapes, we are looking at psychology painted across horizons. I think of the stars too, that quiet, breathtaking moment when father and son gaze upward. The setting here is almost nothing. A night sky, dots of light. And yet, the stillness, the framing, the hushed music turn it into something transcendent. It is in that simple setting that some of the film's deepest philosophy is delivered. The idea of continuity, of presence beyond death, of guidance written in the heavens. It shows that setting need not be grand to be powerful. Sometimes, all you need is silence and a few stars. There are also subtle visual choices that shape mood without calling attention to themselves. The way grass sways in the wind during moments of calm. The use of silhouettes against the horizon at dawn and dusk. The contrast between warm reds and cool blues in conflict scenes. Each of these cinematic touches operates almost subconsciously, guiding our emotions without words. What fascinates me most is that the settings never feel like backdrops pasted behind characters. They feel lived in, essential, almost sacred. Pride Rock, the graveyard, the gorge, the desert, the jungle. Each is a chapter of the story. Each carries meaning that extends beyond geography. And the cinematography ensures that we feel them not just with our eyes, but with our hearts. Even after all these years, when I close my eyes and recall the film, it isn't just the characters that come first. It's the places. The golden plains stretching to infinity. The skeletal remains of giants in the graveyard. The oppressive stillness of the gorge before chaos erupts. the lush overgrowth of exile, the fiery battlefield of redemption, and finally, the cleansing rain falling over restored land. These settings are as much a part of the story as the lions themselves. In the end, that is what gives the film its atmosphere. The fusion of place and feeling, the seamless marriage of setting and story. We don't just watch events happen. We feel the land respond, echoing the characters' journeys, amplifying their triumphs and sorrows. It is cinematic storytelling at its finest, not simply showing us where events occur, but letting the very air, light, and color become storytellers in their own right.